She was humiliated on her very first day in the center of the company lobby. A privileged intern threw an entire cup of Coca-Cola in her face and sneered, "Oops, thought you were janitorial." Sticky soda dripped down her neck, soaking her tied-back hair and thin white blouse. Around her, laughter exploded. She looks like she just crawled out of the basement. But just a few hours later, the CEO himself stepped out before the entire office bowed before her and declared, "Please welcome the new chairwoman of Murata Global." Natalie Carter stood there, her blouse clinging to her skin, the soda still tacky on her neck. Her dark hair, pulled into a neat bun, glistened under the cold white lights of Murata Global's Chicago headquarters. She didn't flinch, didn't wipe her face. Her eyes, a soft hazel, stayed steady, scanning the crowd. The laughter died down unevenly like a car engine sputtering out. A few people shuffled their feet. Someone coughed. Natalie's flat squeaked faintly as she shifted her weight, her temporary trainee badge swaying against her chest. She looked at the intern, Jared. His name was with his slicked-back hair and tailored blazer, and said nothing. Not a word. But the way her jaw tightened just for a second made the air feel heavier. Jared smirked, twirling his empty cup, and walked off toward the buffet. The crowd followed their whispers, trailing like smoke. She stood alone for a moment, the lobby's glass walls reflecting her silhouette against the Chicago skyline. Her blouse was wrinkled, her gray slacks a little too loose, like she'd pulled them from the back of a closet. No one would have guessed she was born into one of the wealthiest families in the country, raised in a world of private tutors and ironclad manners. Natalie didn't carry herself like that. She didn't need to. Her family's name, Carter, wasn't just money. It was power. Old power. The kind that didn't need to shout. But here in this cutthroat corporate machine, no one knew her. She'd made sure of that. The European parent company had sent her to Murata Global's branch to blend in, to watch, to listen. To see who this company really was before she stepped into her role as chairwoman and turned it upside down. As Natalie moved toward the elevator, a group of junior account managers blocked her path, their designer watches glinting under the lights. One of them, a tall woman with a platinum blonde bob and a sneer that could cut glass, leaned in close. "Excuse me, this elevator's for staff, not temps," she said, her voice loud enough to turn heads. "There's a service lift in the back, smells like garbage, but you'll fit right in." The others laughed, their eyes raking over Natalie's damp blouse and plain slacks. She paused, her hand hovering over the elevator button, then turned to face the woman. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes held a quiet fire that made the woman's smirk falter. "I'll take the stairs," Natalie said, her voice even, and walked away, her steps echoing in the sudden silence. The group exchanged uneasy glances, but the blonde just tossed her hair and hit the button, muttering, "Whatever, she's nobody." The lobby was buzzing now, people clustering around the networking mixer's open bar and fancy appetizers. Natalie stayed on the edges, watching. She noticed how people orbited the powerful ones, the executives, the ones with corner offices. Jared was still holding court, tossing out one-liners, his voice carrying over the crowd. Vanessa was nearby, flipping her hair, her laugh too loud. Natalie's eyes caught a flicker of movement, a woman older, maybe in her 60s, with a sharp gray bob and a no-nonsense stare. She was Margaret, a senior advisor who'd been with Murata for decades. Margaret didn't mingle. She stood by a pillar, her arms crossed, watching the room like a hawk. When her gaze landed on Natalie, something shifted. Not pity, not judgment, just recognition. Like she saw something no one else did. Margaret walked over her heels, clicking on the polished floor. Without a word, she handed Natalie a thick folder, the kind with a red confidential stamp on the front. "Direct message from the chairman." Margaret said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "You're to review the restructuring blueprint before tonight's closed meeting." The folder was heavy, stuffed with papers that could make or break careers. A nearby employee, a guy with a too-tight tie and nervous eyes, overheard and froze. "Wait, what?" "Chair, who?" he stammered. Natalie took the folder, her fingers steady, and gave Margaret a small nod. No explanation. No questions. Just a quiet thank you. The guy's jaw dropped, but Natalie was already walking away, the folder tucked under her arm. During a coffee break in the break room, a cluster of marketing associates surrounded Natalie as she reached for a paper towel to dab at her still sticky blouse. One of them, a guy with gelled hair and a loud tie, leaned against the counter, blocking her way. "You know, we've got a dress code here," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "That outfit's giving thrift store clearance rack." His friends snickered, one of them snapping a photo with his phone, the flash catching Natalie's tired eyes. Post that with office fail. Another chimed in, her manicured nails tapping her phone screen. Natalie's hand paused on the towel, her shoulders stiffening just enough to notice. She turned her gaze, locking onto the guy's. Is that all you've got? She asked, her voice soft but sharp, like a blade sliding out of a sheath. The room went quiet, the guy's grin fading as he fumbled for a comeback, but Natalie was already walking out, leaving the towel crumpled on the counter. She headed toward the conference room, the folder's weight grounding her. The hallway was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every sound echo her flats on the carpet, the hum of the air conditioning. She passed a glass-walled office where two employees were whispering, their eyes darting toward her. One of them, a woman with a sleek ponytail and a designer scarf, pointed and laughed. Is that the Coke girl? What's she carrying? Did she steal someone's homework? Her friend cackled, but Natalie kept walking her pace, even her face unreadable. She didn't need to respond. Not yet. The folder in her hands was proof enough of who she was, even if they didn't know it. As Natalie reached the stairwell, a group of interns gathered at the landing, their voices loud and careless. One of them, a wiry kid with a smug grin and a vape pen dangling from his fingers, spotted her and called out, "Hey, you dropped something." He tossed a crumpled napkin at her feet, the group erupting in laughter as it fluttered down. "Pick it up, janitor lady," another jeered, her voice high and mocking. Natalie stopped, her eyes flicking to the napkin, then to the interns. She bent down, picked it up, and tucked it into her pocket with a slow, deliberate motion. "Thanks for the heads up," she said, her tone so calm it felt like a slap. The wiry kid's laugh caught in his throat, and the group went silent as she climbed the stairs, her steps steady, her bag swinging lightly at her side. Down the hall, a facilities manager who'd overheard the exchange quietly noted the interns' names on his clipboard, his jaw tight. When she reached the conference room, the door was ajar. She stepped inside the long mahogany table gleaming under the lights. It was empty, but the air felt charged like a storm was coming. She set the folder down, her fingers lingering on the cover. For a moment she stood still, her eyes tracing the skyline through the window. She wasn't thinking about the soda still drying on her skin or the laughter still ringing in her ears. She was thinking about the company, its numbers, its people, its rot. She'd been sent here to fix it, to cut out the dead weight. And she was starting to see exactly where to start. Vanessa's voice cut through the silence. "Hey, this room's for management only," she said, standing in the doorway, her red dress looking even brighter under the fluorescent lights, like she was trying to outshine the room itself. "The training room's down by the copier. You know where the trainees belong." Her tone was sharp, but there was a nervous edge to it, like she wasn't sure why Natalie was here. Natalie turned, her eyes locking onto Vanessa's. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Natalie said, "I must have misread the schedule," her voice calm, almost gentle. But the way she held Vanessa's gaze made the air feel tight. Vanessa smirked, but it wobbled. "Yeah, well, don't let it happen again," she said, turning on her heel. Natalie watched her go, then picked up the folder and left her steps as steady as ever. As Natalie walked past the HR department, a memo pinned to the bulletin board caught her eye. A list of new hires, her name scrawled at the bottom in pen as if added as an afterthought. A junior HR rep, a wiry guy with a smug grin, noticed her looking and stepped forward. "Oh, you're the trainee, right?" "That list's for actual employees," he said loud enough for the nearby cubicles to hear. "Don't worry, we'll get you a proper badge, maybe next month." Laughter rippled through the office, heads popping up over cubicle walls like vultures spotting prey. Natalie's fingers brushed the edge of the memo, her eyes scanning her own handwritten name. She didn't look at the rep, he just tore the memo down, folded it neatly, and slipped it into her bag. "I'll keep this," she said, her voice calm but carrying a weight that made the rep's grin falter. As she walked away, a senior HR manager who'd been watching from her office picked up her phone, her expression grim, and dialed the board. In the hallway, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her thumb swiping the screen. It was a call from Global Legal, the voice on the other end crisp and formal. "Ms. Carter, all share transfers are finalized. You're now the legal chairwoman of our U.S. branch. Tonight is your formal announcement." Natalie paused, her eyes flicking to a framed photo on the wall, a black and white shot of Murata's first office decades ago. Her grandfather had been in that photo, shaking hands with the founder. She'd seen it 1,000 times growing up, heard the stories of how the Carters built their legacy. "I'll wait and see who deserves to stay after this restructure," she said into the phone, her voice low but firm. The lawyer didn't argue. He knew better. During a team huddle in the open plan office, a senior strategist with a booming voice and a penchant for name-dropping spotted Natalie standing quietly at the edge of the group. He pointed at her, his gold cufflinks flashing. "Hey, you coffee run girl," he barked, tossing a $20 bill at her feet. "Get me a latte extra foam and make it quick. You're not here to stand around looking lost." The room erupted in snickers, people nudging each other, phones already out to capture the moment. Natalie's eyes dropped to the bill, then lifted to meet his. She didn't bend down, didn't touch the money. "I don't drink coffee," she said, her voice quiet but cutting like a wire-pulled taut. The strategist's face reddened, but before he could respond, she turned and walked away, leaving the bill on the floor. A quiet intern nearby slipped the bill into his pocket, his eyes wide, and later that day he was seen in the CEO's office handing over a list of names starting with the strategists. Back at the mixer, the mood had shifted. People were looser now, the wine flowing, the conversations louder. Natalie stood by the buffet, her folder tucked away in her bag. She was sipping water, her eyes scanning the room when Jared sauntered over, his grin wide and mean. "Well, look who's still here," he said, holding a fresh glass of Coca-Cola. Before she could move, he tilted the glass, letting the soda splash across her blouse, her hair, her face. The room froze. Then the laughter came sharp and cruel like glass breaking. "She looks like she just climbed out of the basement," someone muttered. Another voice louder, "Guess she's showcasing her adaptability, huh?" Natalie stood still, the soda dripping down her chin, her eyes red but dry. She didn't wipe her face, didn't step back, just looked at Jared, her gaze steady, unblinking. He laughed, but it was forced, like he wasn't sure why he felt cold. As the mixer wound down, a junior executive with a clipboard approached Natalie, her lips pursed in a thin line. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, her voice clipped like she was scolding a child. She pointed to Natalie's badge, the word trainee glaring under the lights. "This is an invite-only event. I don't know who let you in, but you need to leave. Now." The crowd nearby turned, their eyes glinting with amusement, some pulling out their phones to record. Natalie's fingers tightened around her water glass, but her face stayed calm. She set the glass down, her movements slow, deliberate. "I'll go," she said, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the murmurs. As she walked toward the exit, a man in a corner office who'd been watching silently picked up his phone and sent a text to the board. "Carter's here." "They don't know." The junior executive smirked, oblivious, as Natalie's shadow passed under the doorway. The laughter was still echoing when Margaret appeared, her face like stone. She didn't say a word, just pointed to a security camera in the corner, its red light blinking. Natalie's eyes followed, then flicked back to Jared. She didn't need to speak. The room was starting to shift, people whispering, glancing at their phones. Minutes later, the executive board got the security footage, Natalie drenched in soda, standing tall as the laughter roared around her. Someone in the crowd gasped, "Oh my God, that's Carter." The head of HR, a balding man with a nervous tic, turned pale. "We're screwed," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Natalie didn't react. She just picked up her bag, the soda still dripping from her hair, and walked out her flats, silent on the carpet. In the cafeteria the next day, Natalie sat alone, her tray holding a simple apple and a bottle of water. A group of data analysts, their laptops open and their egos louder, noticed her and started whispering. One of them, a woman with a sleek updo and a voice like a foghorn, stood up and walked over. "You're in my seat," she said, her hands on her hips, her tone daring Natalie to argue. "This is where the analytics team sits, not whatever you are." She gestured at Natalie's plain outfit, her colleagues snickering behind her. Natalie's hand paused on her apple, her eyes lifting to meet the woman's. She stood, picked up her tray, and said, "It's yours now." Her voice was calm, but the way she held the woman's gaze made the analyst step back, her confidence wavering. As Natalie walked away, a quiet server nearby who'd been watching slipped a note to the cafeteria manager detailing the incident and the woman's name. The next morning, Natalie was back at Murata's headquarters, her blouse clean but still plain, her slacks still a little loose. She walked to the reception desk, her badge clipped to her belt. The receptionist, a young woman with a tight smile and too much eyeliner, barely looked up. "You're not on the list for today's CEO and chairwoman strategy meeting," she said, her tone cold like she was dismissing a delivery driver. A few employees nearby snickered. "Maybe she's trying to crash the meeting to save face after yesterday." One of them whispered loud enough for Natalie to hear. She didn't respond. Just stood there, her hands folded, her eyes calm but sharp. The receptionist glanced up, confused by her silence, then looked back at her computer typing furiously. During a lunch break, Natalie sat alone at a cafeteria table, her tray holding a simple sandwich and a water bottle. A group of creative directors, their suits pressed and their egos louder, spotted her and approached. One of them, a woman with a sharp jawline and a diamond bracelet, leaned over the table, her voice syrupy with condescension. "Sweetie, this table's for department heads. You're in the wrong spot again." She flicked her wrist, knocking Natalie's water bottle to the floor, the cap popping off and water pooling under the table. The others laughed, one of them recording the spill on his phone, zooming in on Natalie's soaked flats. She didn't move, didn't reach for the bottle. Her eyes met the woman's, steady and unyielding. "I'll clean it up," Natalie said, her voice quiet but firm, and knelt to retrieve the bottle, her movements slow, deliberate. The woman's smile froze her confidence, cracking as Natalie stood and walked away, leaving the spilled water behind. As Natalie walked back to her desk, a facilities coordinator with a clipboard and a permanent scowl stopped her in the hallway. "You're not authorized to use this floor's printer," he said, pointing at the stack of papers in her hand. Budget reports she'd been asked to review. "Interns use the basement machines." "Don't make me report you." A few passers-by slowed down, smirking, one of them whispering, "She's really pushing her luck." Natalie's fingers tightened around the papers, but her face stayed calm. She handed the stack to the coordinator, her eyes never leaving his. "Check the signature on those," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. He flipped through, his scowl fading as he saw the chairman's initials on every page. He stammered, but Natalie was already walking away, leaving him clutching the papers like they were burning. The meeting room doors opened and the CEO stepped out. He was young, maybe early 30s, with a sharp jawline and a suit that looked like it cost more than most people's rent. He spotted Natalie immediately, his eyes locking onto hers. Without a word, he bowed low, deliberate, the kind of gesture you don't see in a corporate office. The room went dead silent. Jared, standing near to the back, dropped his phone, the clatter echoing. Vanessa took a shaky step back, her red dress suddenly looking too bright, too loud. The CEO straightened, his voice clear and steady. "Everyone, I'd like to introduce our new chairwoman of Murata Global's U.S. Division M's, Natalie Carter. She will personally lead our entire corporate restructure." The air seemed to leave the room. Heads turned, mouths opened, but no one spoke. As the meeting began, Natalie stood at the head of the table, her folder open, her eyes scanning the room. A senior board member, a grizzled man with decades at Murata, stood and cleared his throat. "Me, Carter," he said, his voice steady but respectful. "We've been waiting for your input. Your family's legacy precedes you." The room shifted, eyes widening as the name Carter sank in. Jared's face drained of color, his hands gripping the table. Vanessa's pen froze mid-note, her breath catching. Natalie didn't acknowledge the shift, just nodded and began outlining the restructure, her voice calm, her authority undeniable. The board member sat down, his deference a signal to the room. This was no trainee. Natalie didn't smile, didn't nod. She just stood there, her hands still folded, her badge still reading trainee. But the way she carried herself, shoulders back, chin up, eyes steady, said everything. Jared's face was white, his hands fumbling to pick up his phone. Vanessa's smirk was gone, her eyes darting to the floor. The receptionist froze, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Natalie didn't look at any of them. She just walked toward the meeting room, her steps, even her bag, swinging lightly at her side. The CEO held the door for her, and she stepped inside, the folder under her arm. The fallout came fast. By noon, Jared and Vanessa were suspended pending an investigation for workplace misconduct. The security footage had been enough, no one could argue with that. The head of HR sent out a company-wide email, all formal language and apologies, but it didn't matter. The whispers were already spreading. Natalie didn't need to say a word. She didn't need to fire anyone herself. The board was doing it for her, their panic palpable. The employees who'd been kind, a quiet IT guy who'd offered her a towel after the soda incident, a junior designer who'd smiled at her in the hallway, found themselves called into her office later that week. Not for a lecture, but for a promotion. She didn't say much, just thanked them and handed them new contracts. That afternoon, an email from the European parent company landed in every executive's inbox, signed by the global chairman himself. It was brief, formal, and devastating. Ms. Natalie Carter has been appointed chairwoman effective immediately. All personnel are to cooperate fully with her restructuring initiatives. The creative director who'd spilled Natalie's water bottle sat frozen at her desk, her diamond bracelet suddenly feeling heavy. She opened her phone only to find her latest social media post, a snarky comment about the trainee's fashion sense, had been screenshotted and sent to the board. By evening, her department head had called her in her contract termination letter already printed. During a quiet moment in the break room, a maintenance worker, an older woman with calloused hands and a kind smile, approached Natalie as she refilled her water bottle. "I saw what they did to you," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You're stronger than they know." Natalie paused, her fingers tightening around the bottle, her eyes meeting the woman's. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried a warmth that hadn't been there before. The next morning, the maintenance worker found a letter on her locker, a promotion to facilities supervisor signed by Natalie. The news spread through the lower ranks, a quiet wave of respect building for the woman who'd walked through fire without flinching. The story hit the press a few days later. New York Business ran the headline, "The woman drenched in coke is now worth millions." It was everywhere online, on X, and the break room whispers. Jared's name was dragged through the mud, his internship offers vanishing overnight. Vanessa's LinkedIn went silent, her profile picture replaced with a blank avatar. The employees who'd laughed were quieter now, their eyes avoiding Natalie's when she passed them in the halls. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't even look at them. She just kept working her desk covered in reports, her phone buzzing with calls from the European office. In a final board meeting, Natalie sat at the head of the table, her plain blouse and slacks unchanged, but her presence filling the room. A junior executive, one of the few who'd stayed quiet during the mixer, stood and handed her a sealed envelope. This came from the European office, he said, his voice steady but reverent. Inside was a handwritten note from the global chairman, her father's old friend. "You've done us proud, Natalie. Lead with the strength you've always had." The room watched as she read it, her expression unreadable, but her hands steady. She folded the note, slipped it into her pocket, and continued the meeting, her voice calm, her decisions final. The junior executive was later named her deputy, his loyalty rewarded without a word. On her last day in Chicago, Natalie stood on the rooftop of Murata's headquarters. The wind was soft, tugging at her hair, which she'd let down for the first time all week. It fell in loose waves, catching the late afternoon light. The city stretched out below her, all steel and glass and noise. She didn't need to say anything to anyone. Didn't need to prove herself. The truth had done that for her. She'd walked through their laughter, their cruelty, their dismissal, and come out the other side. Not louder. Not angrier. Just taller. Her husband arrived quietly, his presence shifting the air without a word. He was tall, unassuming, with a calm that matched hers. He didn't need to speak. The way the room stilled when he walked in said enough. Natalie turned to him, her eyes softening for the first time all day. She didn't need rescuing, she never had. But his presence was a reminder she wasn't alone. The city hummed below, and she smiled just barely, her hands steady on the railing. She'd been judged her whole life. Looked down on, dismissed, mocked for being too quiet, too plain, too restrained. But she'd learned something early on. You don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to stand. And when you do, the world adjusts. It always does. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.